Hi everyone, and welcome back to part 2 of my video series on my summer astro imaging project, the Veil Nebula complex. And so last time we talked about how we plan and set up a mosaic to be able to shoot, a large target or a target that maybe you want to capture at a smaller or a longer focal length so you can get more detail in it, and that kind of thing, and set up our initial sequence. So I was using kind of a dummy sequence last time. This time, this is where I am in the sequence that I've set up and actually been running here. And the first thing that you may notice that's different is I've got another target in my project. And I do this a lot when I have something that I'm going to shoot for several nights, and I want to either maybe do more than just my project so that I get some kind of instant gratification, or in the case of this one, as I mentioned last time, in order to shoot any of these, I kind of wait for this to get to about 49 or 50 degrees up so that it clears the roof of my house on the east side. Well, that means anything that's to the south or the west, I might be able to shoot while I'm waiting on that. Since this is at 11:20, that gives me about an hour to shoot something else beforehand. So in my case, I set up a target for the Omega Nebula, which is more in the southern sky, that I can start taking images of earlier in the evening. And I just set up a really nice round of exposures here for all the filters at 5 minutes, and I'm just letting it slowly build up. It's about an hour a night that it'll take a few images and just slowly add up to this list, which gives me something else to add on to, so I'm not wasting time when there's a good night out to shoot. So I encourage you guys to kind of keep things like that in mind. It doesn't need to be as many shots or as lengthy here, but maybe you do the Omega Nebula one night, the Eagle Nebula another night, and have some fun taking some quicker sets of images of something that you can play around with while you're spending a lot of time building your project. So if we look at where I am right now, I'm at about 43 some odd frames taken kind of per target here. And as I mentioned last time, I'm just kind of building up, 7 to 8 frames each night per target and filter. So kind of reset it this morning to say, okay, now I want to go to 50. And then at one point I will decide, okay, I've had enough here, or the weather's turning, that kind of thing. And that'll be, the final set of images I get before I really start heavily messing with this. But there's an important couple of things that I wanted to bring up here before we start getting into the idea of what happens after you have all of the frames taken, right? The first one is organization. So if you're taking these frames night after night after night, it can be very easy to get confused about things like calibration files, right? If you're using something like a DSLR that isn't a cooled camera, where you need to take darks for a particular night at a temperature, or you're doing different flats and things like that, you really want to make sure that your light frames are well organized and that your calibration frames are organized with them. What I always make sure that I do in Sequence Generator Pro, and they do some of this by default, is you set up a naming scheme here. They do a pretty good job of giving you a reference key of, punch in these things in order to do your directory and file naming automatically. And so I try to put in all the pieces of information that I think I'm going to need as part of the file name. Now, a lot of this is saved to the FITS headers in my camera, so why would I want these on the file name as well? It's really to make sure that I never get in a situation where I end up overwriting one good file with another good file that were taken at different times and just happen to have the same name. And I also want to make sure I can always pair up my calibration frames, and we'll see kind of how I do that here in a minute. And you can also have the button next to it that'll give you a nice sample of what all that gobbledygook comes out as, right? So for me, I have it go ahead and put everything into the kind of default Sequence Generator Pro folder here. And then it starts by doing a subfolder of the date and the target name. So that's going to help me keep, the different panels of this mosaic separate from each other. And then underneath that, it puts that target name again. So just in case I have all the files in a folder together, which will happen from time to time on a project like this, I still know which one it is. I know whether or not it was a light frame, a flat frame, etc., which filter was used, the duration of the exposure, whether or not I did any binning, what gain level was kind of set. In this case, it's giving the NAs because the gain is kind of set at the individual event level. And then lastly, I have it put in the date down here as well. Now, I know the date is in the folder, but as I said, sometimes these, when you're working through processing a lot of these things and you're taking them over multiple nights, eventually you end up with these frames, some level of, in the process, these frames are all sitting in the same folder. And if you've named two of them exactly the same, and you've got a frame one from Tuesday and a frame one from Wednesday, then you end up with a situation of, should I overwrite this? Which of course you don't want to do. And the last thing I want to do is have to hand update file names for a bunch of these. So that's why I always put the date into the file name itself as well. So it's just another check to kind of keep them separated from any other frame I would take on any other day. So as I mentioned before, it's kind of going through and building up some of these. And the last thing I would want to do is get to 43 frames and then go in and start trying to process them and notice now I have a problem. That something in my acquisition plan was wrong. You really don't want to run across something like that. You want to, like anything, you want to find out the problem early so you can correct early and move on with your life. So what I would recommend is after you take your first night worth of images, you go and do a full kind of processing run on that set of images and kind of a test run of the mosaicing process to make sure that you have enough room, things were turned, the camera orientation was right, you were locked on center, all that kind of thing. You didn't overexpose or underexpose with the amount of time you took. All of these things can be big problems if you've spent, in this case, if I'm taking about 8 a night or so, right? I'm kind of about a week in worth of photos that I've been taking, right? And you don't want to have a week worth of imaging nights wasted because of something that could be as simple as something I've done before, where I had my mouse here and I was doing something else and I was just started playing around. Just started playing around with my mouse wheel, right? And wasn't even thinking about it. And before I know it, my repeat number, actually I'm going the wrong direction here, but I accidentally set my repeat number to 1, right? And so the next day I look up and this is actually only taken 1 frame and it said it's done and moved on to the next one. I want to catch something like that early if I can. Let me get this back to my 50. There we go. So once again, I won't forget about it. So once you've taken those photos, go ahead and move them off to where you're going to process them. In my case, I do that on my desktop machine. So I'm going to go ahead and close down TeamViewer for now. And here we are in PixInsight. So PixInsight is where I do most of my processing for anything that's especially complicated or I'm going for very detailed work. I've done some other videos where I've done some playing around with things in Lightroom, and I know a lot of people live by Photoshop or GIMP or other photo applications. PixInsight is by no means the only way that you can do this kind of stuff. It's just the one that I've put the most time and effort into learning. So I believe that I've seen plenty of videos out there on doing mosaics and processing in Deep Sky Stacker, which is free, or in Photoshop and things like that. So if those are your tools of choice, feel free to kind of take what I'm going to go through here as concepts, and then apply that to looking for videos on the specifics on whatever piece of software you use. So to start off with, I'm going to need to actually go ahead and calibrate all of the files that I've taken. And I'm only going to do this for kind of one night worth of files, just to kind of show you what I would do after a first night session. So the first thing is I need to figure out where I put everything. So I'm just going to double click here on the desktop in PixInsight to get to where I keep kind of all my stuff organized. I've got an external drive. I would invest in several of the relatively large size, medium speed drives if you can. I actually pretty much just leave my images in here and even process off of this 1 terabyte drive. And as I fill one up, I will move to another. The other thing I would recommend is that you back up your work periodically. That's something that I am not always as good at. But keeping copies of this stuff in more than one place is really good, especially with your final images. So first I'm going to go in looking for my light frames. As you can see, I've had some changes in how I have Sequence Generator Pro mark these up as we go. I used to do everything as just the date itself, but then I started noticing, well, what if I have more than one target in a night? It would be nice if those files were separated automatically. So I had it start adding that into the mix as well. And having this date in this format where you go year, then month, then day is really nice to make sure everything is always in a good order. And keeping that date on it means even if you move it around to different locations, it'll always stay in pretty good shape. So scrolling down here to the set that I've been doing, you can see I've been doing these Veil Nebula ones for quite a while here. And not every night is a Veil Nebula, an Omega Nebula night. I had some where I was doing North American Nebula. You can obviously change up however you want, but as a long-term project, I'm kind of keeping this in the mix as I go through and I get these clear nights. So our first night doing this was actually the 4th of July. So, good starting night there after all the fireworks. So I've got my 4 frames. The first thing that I want to check is making sure, now these aren't calibrated at all yet, but I just am going to take a quick check before I go through the effort of processing these at all, that I got what I was looking for and that it kind of lined up. So, you can do this like a jigsaw puzzle if you can kind of remember the order of things, or you can go back into your planning map and kind of double check what should be where. But I know this guy is my top left corner, so okay. So now looking through here, does it look like I've got things right? And looking at it, it does. These connect up. I saw the overlap on these, and based off of what my shooting target was, it looks like I'm in the right ballpark. None of these are off at some weird angle that doesn't really match up with a square. I'm probably going to have some parts where the overlap is better or worse than others. Actually, I think this is supposed to be overlapped to about there. There we go. That seems better. So there'll be some parts where the overlap's a little bit tighter, a little bit looser. I'll probably have some bars here and there, but this is on track. This is looking like it's in the right ballpark. So that's fantastic. So now I'm going to go ahead and close these up and say, all right, now we can go ahead and start processing things. Now, the steps for processing are pretty much always the same if you can take the time to do it right. So the first thing is you want to be able to take your light frames, the actual shots that you're trying to take out at night. And then you have a series of calibration frames. There are a lot better videos going into the details of what each of these frames are and what they're good for. But in my case, I take dark frames that are matched to the exposure length and the temperature and the gain setting for the camera. And then I take flat frames, which are matched basically to the filter, the rough focus that I was at when I was taking the images, and the gain of the camera. And I also tend to do the temperature, although that's not as important on those frames. And then lastly, depending on your camera, you may do bias frames, or in my case, I do flat dark frames. So the idea on that is if you have a dark frame that's calibrating your light image, you can use a dark frame that's matched to your flat image to calibrate that. The reason why I do that is this particular camera, the ASI 1600, from what I've read, works a lot better with a flat dark or a dark flat, however you say it, versus a bias frame. And I found, for me, it seems like that's holding true, so that's what I've been sticking with. So we need to take all those frames and process them together. There's a lot of different processes that you can go through at different points in time for integrating all of your dark frames together, all of your flat frames together, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go through each step of that process. And it's done. I'm going to exit out. And let's take a look here. So we said we want everything to go into our Veil Nebula combined project folder, created this video test, and it automatically created a calibrated folder, light, and then put everything in here together. So we should have a file for everyone that we put in. So that's great. So let's go ahead and pick a few of these. I'm just going to deal with the HAs in general here, just in the interest of time. I'm going to pick my first HA from each one and say open all of them. So here we go. Moment of truth here. And that one looks pretty good too. Now, each one of these probably has a little bit more gradient still in it, things like that, that can be removed through background extraction and all the other fun processing stuff that you're going to do. But it looks like, at the very least, each one of my sets of images was on target, and I've got the right kind of process for calibrating them, so I know that I'm going to be okay going forward. Now, the last thing that I want to do before I really start taking hundreds of images is make sure that these will actually fit into the mosaic. We did kind of that quick puzzle piecey lineup, but now I want to make sure that it will actually stitch together without any crazy gaps in it. So first step of that is I need to make sure they're kind of oriented the right way. And so I've looked at my original map and I know, okay, this is the right orientation for this frame. So it's good. I'm going to go ahead and shrink it down. This one, however, needs to rotate 180 degrees, probably due to a meridian flip. So I'm going to go to Image, Geometry, rotate it. And that one's good too, so we'll shrink him up. This one is the right way up, so that's good. And lastly, this one is also the right way up, so. All right. So the first step of this process, there's several different ways that you can make a mosaic, but the one that I find works best for me tries to take the idea of distortion out of account. So, any lens you have is going to have some sort of slight distortion on it when you're using it. Same with any telescope. So that'll mean that the edges of these are ever so slightly curved versus a nice flat single image. So one of the ways to get around this to make sure that you don't end up with little black lines if you don't have enough overlap in there is to essentially use the plate solve function to make sure that the stars are actually lined up with where they are in the night sky, which will kind of correct for some of that distortion. So in order to do that, the first thing that you really need to do is plate solve each of these images. So what I'm going to do here is just for an example so that I'm not doing it across all of the different images I have. I'm just going to do it one by one for the specific images here. So we'll start with this one, and then we're going to go to scripts, image analysis, and then we're looking for image solver. So once we get that here, I've got my active window up. I'm going to use active window as the selection here. Once I have all my files together, I'd use list of files instead. So image parameters, if this one says it assumes it's already solved, I'm not going to leave that. I'm going to leave that on. I want to make sure that we solve it here. And then you can do distortion correction in this. Right now, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to leave it alone. But I just want it to go ahead and kind of solve this so that the picture will know where the coordinates are. So I'm going to just leave it. Basically, I've left everything at default. The only thing I made sure to do is that this focal distance was right. So this is the focal length of my telescope. Same with the pixel size. That's important in order for this to pull out. Now, pretty much all of this was pulled in from the FITS header, but if it's not, you want to fill all that in. I'm going to say OK. And let's make sure that it runs correctly. Looks like it did. Yep. All right, so this one has been solved. I'm going to go ahead and move it up there. We're just going to do it for each of these. All right, so now that each one of these is solved, the coordinates have been assigned on to those images. And after that, the next thing we want to do is go ahead and do a mosaic, but have it do it based on those coordinates that were just put on here. So in order to do that, we go and we find a script that does just that. Under utilities, there's one called Mosaic by Coordinates, and that's exactly what it's trying to do. So in this case, because we've done these and these are the windows that are open, we're going to go ahead and add the windows and select all four that we've got there. And we're going to see, okay, what do we need to do here? Right now, I'm going to leave this alone. And then it does have a thing for outputting the images there. It's essentially registering them together. So I'm going to go ahead and put this in the video test directory. And we're just going to go ahead and let it run with the defaults here. All right, and so the process is done. And what we've got now are 4 pieces of our puzzle. So I'm going to go ahead and just use a script here to just do an auto STF across everything. And you'll see what it's put together. So basically what we have are our puzzle pieces scaled up to the right scale of the final mosaic, and then blacked out for everywhere that wasn't in part of the image. So now it makes our kind of puzzle fitting a little bit easier than where we were before, because essentially everything has been aligned. So you see all those are kind of together, but I still don't have the mosaic built finally. And that's going to take us to the next part, which will be the gradient merge mosaic. And that is actually, if I remember correctly, under processes. And there we go, gradient merge mosaic. Now this one is a little bit different. Almost everything else that we've done up until now had you can work off of the windows piece. This one does not. This one only works off of the files themselves. So before we can use it, we're going to need to save each one of these files. So let's go ahead and save them and make sure that we're putting in enough info to just remember what they are if we need to go back to them later. So now that these are all saved, we can actually go ahead and add those same files in. So we need to go into that master area, the video test, got our 4 files. Add them in there. What type of combination are we doing? We're going to say average. I'm actually not even going to mess with any of these, but if you look up the gradient merge mosaic process, you can kind of play around with these here to try to get them to match up a little bit better. But right now, I'm not trying to make a final mosaic, right, with all the stacked images together. I'm just testing to make sure that everything that I'm taking actually lines up enough to cover the area that I need to cover when I do make my final mosaic. So I'm going to go ahead and apply global here. And let's see, this will take a little bit to run. And it's finished. So now it's unstretched, but we're really at our moment of truth now. I can see stars in all 4 corners, so it looks like we put something together. Let's hit our STF auto button and see what we get. Boom. There we go. So now we have a mosaic. Now these are individual sub-exposures, right? So no stacking and everything else. This is not our final image quality, but it is basically our final image alignment. And so you notice we're not perfect on everything. We've got our black bars around here at different sides, but where we're really concerned about the most are these center overlap areas. Do we have gaps? No, we don't. And that's perfect. That's exactly what we would want to see. Now this gradient merge mosaic, which we'll definitely be using again in the later part of the video, this is what is keeping us from getting just a dead line here, right? It actually is merging and overlapping these frames so that, yeah, I can tell there's a little bit different noise over here than there is over there, but it also feels like there is a transition. The seams are not super hard and obvious unless you are extremely zoomed in. But now we've been able to prove that we can take our single image that we had over on this one and our single one that we had over on this one and create the actual mosaic, and that things are going to line up. My black areas are all at the edges here, right? You can tell that this isn't a straight line here, right? It's not parallel to this one, so there's a little bit of curve on each one of these, and that's because I'm hand rotating it. But it doesn't need to be perfect as long as you have enough overlap. If you don't have enough overlap, you'll see these kind of wedges running in towards the center of where your panels line up. And that's where you'll want to come back into the Mosaic Planner in Sequence Generator Pro and that framing and mosaic tool and redo it with a larger overlap percentage. If you put in 10% before and maybe you're just not able to really narrow in the dial in the rotation on your camera well enough, then maybe move it from 10% to 20%, and that'll shrink your edge to edge a bit, but it'll ensure that you don't have these gaps in the center, which is what you really want to avoid. At the end of the day, you want a nice seamless full image all the way across. So that's it for this part of this video, that's it for this video. On the next one, what we're going to do is we're going to work from the finished set of images. So once I've finished taking, I think I'm going to stop at basically 50 exposures for each panel. Once we have those, essentially kind of going through this same process again, we'll probably do it a little bit more quickly the next time to see the final mosaic before we start getting into processing that to really bring out the colors, combining it all together with the O3 data and all that kind of good stuff. So hope that's helpful to you if you're starting to think about doing this own process yourself and that kind of thing. And until next time, I wish everybody clear skies. Thanks.